Chapter 12. As I explained to Rose, the windmill wouldn't work without wind. On calm, quiet nights, I'd be stuck in the dark looking for matches. The only way I could change this was to find a battery. But while I waited for one, I still managed to use my windmill for other purposes. My cousin Ruth, who was Uncle Socrates' daughter, happened to be visiting from Mizuzu town. She was older and married and had a mobile phone, and often she would bug me to take it to the trading center and charge it for her. A few guys in the trading center were making loads of money charging phones for people who didn't have electricity in their homes. These guys would cut deals with shopkeepers, who allowed them to string an extension cord out the door where they kept a small shaded stall. They sold scratch cards for phone units, and a few even had mobile phones on a table you could pay to make calls, kind of like an open air phone booth. These stalls can be found all over Malawi. In the bigger towns like Lilongwe, some guys even powered photocopiers and electric typewriters this way, and let people prepare their resumes and then call about an available job, all on the sidewalk or the dirt road. Of course, the constant blackouts weren't so good for their businesses. One day, I was complaining and taking Ruth's phone to the trading center again when she said, "Why can't you just charge phones with your windmill? It produces electricity, doesn't it?" I'd already thought about this, but I knew I didn't get enough voltage from my bicycle dynamo to power a charger. My dynamo produced 12 volts, but a charger needs 220. 12 volts was fine for a light bulb, but not strong enough for heavier jobs. I had already discovered that energy decreases as it passes through wire over long distances. I used that concept when testing a radio against the dynamo, but for this I needed to build something called a setup transformer. Power companies across the world, especially in Europe and America, set up power all the time. Huge alternators generate electricity in a power station, but as my previous experiment demonstrated, it loses strength on the way to your home. To remedy this, the power company installs setup transformers in places along the route that boost the power before sending it on its way. A setup transformer has two coils, the primary and secondary, that are wrapped side by side around a core. Alternating current flows back and forth and is constantly changing, and this change causes the primary coil to induce a charge in the secondary coil. This process is called mutual induction, which means that voltage from one coil jumps to another. The result is that the overall voltage is increased. I had learned about this in a chapter in Explaining Physics entitled Mutual Induction in Transformers, which also featured a picture of a man with white hair and a bow tie. This was Michael Faraday, who invented the first transformer in 1831. What a good feeling that must have been. Using the diagrams from this chapter, I was determined to make my own setup transformer. First, I used some sharp pliers and cut an iron sheet into an E. The diagram demonstrated 24 volts being transformed to 240. I knew that voltage increased with each turn of the wire. The diagram showed the primary coil to have 200 turns, while the secondary had 2,000. A bunch of mathematical equations were below the diagram. I assumed they explained how I could make my own conversions, but instead I just started rapping like mad and hoped it would work. I connected the dynamo wires to the primary coil, while the secondary coil was wired directly into the prongs of a phone charger. I got quite a shock while I was tying those bare wires to the charger, but once they were attached, I was ready to plug in the phone. Ruth was standing over me, watching carefully. "Don't blow it up," she said. "I know what I'm doing," I said, lying. I plugged in the phone jack, but instead of blowing up, the screen lit up and the bars began moving up and down the side. It worked. "See," I said, "told you." To make things easier, I went a step further and made an electrical socket in my wall, just like at Gilbert's house. I had a radio that operated on both batteries and AC electricity. In these kinds of radios, one end of the power cord usually plugs into the AC socket, and the other end goes into the wall of your house. To get electricity in my room, I simply transferred this system into my wall. I pulled out the entire AC socket from the radio and fixed it into a wall mount made from flattened PVC pipe. I cut a hole in my wall and installed the mount so it looked like a normal electrical socket, then connected the windmill wires from the outside. I reattached the radio's power cord to the AC socket, then cut off the electrical plug that normally shoves into the wall. Taking those severed wires, I attached them directly to the phone charger. It was kind of backwards, but it worked. When news of the invention reached the trading center, the line of people arriving to charge their phones reached the road. Most of the time, people still pretended to be skeptical that I could do this. I think they were hoping I wouldn't charge them money. Are you sure this thing can charge my phone? I'm positive. Prove it. See, it charges. My God, you're right. But leave it for a little while longer. I'm still not convinced. After 2 months of using this method, I finally went bitter. I was always on the lookout for a car battery. Then one day I noticed that Charity had one at his house. I found it on the road, he said. It must have fallen off a truck. Wherever it came from, I started begging and pleading with him until finally he agreed to sell it to me on installments. From studying my books, I knew that in order to charge the battery, which uses DC power, I had to first convert the AC power produced by the bicycle dynamo. My book talked about certain things called diodes, or rectifiers, which are found in many radios and electronic devices and convert the power for you. The type of rectifier I needed looked like a tiny D-cell battery on a long metal skewer and reminded me of the smoked mice that young boys sell on the roadside as snacks. Studying the picture, I opened one of my broken 6-volt radios and easily found a diode. Once again, I fashioned a soldering iron out of a thick metal cable I heated in the fire, then fused the diode to the wire between the windmill and battery. It was so simple. I then replaced the standard AC phone charger with a DC model that plugs into a car's cigarette lighter, a gift from my cousin Ruth. With the battery, I was also now able to install 3 additional bulbs in the house, all running on a parallel circuit. For some reason, the light from the bicycle dynamo still worked using DC power. However, regular incandescent bulbs used in most homes will only work with AC power, so I had to look for alternatives. I managed to find small car bulbs in Dowd's shop that worked on DC. One was a brake light, and the others were headlamps. I installed one bulb outside just above my door, another in my parents' bedroom, and one in the living room. When the battery was fully charged, I could store enough power for 3 full days, even when the wind was still. I constructed a simple light switch for each bulb using bicycle spokes and strips of iron. For the toggles, I wanted a good non-conductive material that I could easily shape the way I wanted. So taking my knife, I carved out several round buttons from my old broken pair of flip-flops. I mounted these switches inside small boxes I'd made from melted PVC pipe. A standard light switch has 3 separate wires, one from the power supply to the switch, one from the switch to the bulb, and one from the bulb to the power supply. Whenever I pushed the flip-flop button, the spoke and iron connected the terminals, completing the circuit. Finally, I could touch the wall and get lights. Not long after I'd completed this wiring, I walked into the living room one night and found my family sitting around listening to the radio. My mother sat on the floor in the corner, crocheting a beautiful orange tablecloth. My father and sisters just stared ahead, lost in the news program on Radio 1. I pretended to be one of the reporters on the radio, barging in with my microphone. I'm now standing in the living room with the Honorable Papa Kamkwamba, I said in a deep, serious voice. Mr. Kamkwamba, this room used to be so dark and sad at this hour. Now look at you, enjoying electricity like a city person. Oh, said my father, smiling, enjoying it more than a city person. You mean because there's no blackouts and you owe Escom nothing? Well, yes, said my father, but also because my own son made it. Having lights at night was a remarkable improvement in my family's life. However, it still wasn't perfect. The battery and wires I used were not the best quality. The wire Charity had given me had run out, so I was mainly using bits and pieces of wire I found in the scrapyard. Some of these wires were never meant for electricity, but I used them anyway. My patchwork of fused together wires weren't covered in plastic insulation, but were bare and often sparked when I connected them to the battery terminals. Since I didn't have a proper conduit to house them, the positive and negative wires leading from the bulbs and switches were simply nailed to the walls and across the ceiling like a heap of Christmas lights. I took great care not to cross them, since my poor roof was made from wood and grass and could easily catch fire. Worse, the blue gum poles that supported the thatching had long been infested by termites. Each night I went to bed hearing the sounds of their teeth nibbling away, only to wake up in the morning to little piles of sawdust on the floor. Their constant appetite had finally hollowed the beams, causing them to sag a bit. Having a mess of bare electrical wires strung across these beams made them even more dangerous. It wasn't long before it nearly caused an accident. One afternoon, after a big storm, I returned from Jeffrey's house and discovered that the beam had finally broken, probably from the wind pushing on it. My ceiling now sagged in the middle and my floor was covered in dirt and grass. The broken beam had also dumped hundreds of squirming termites onto the floor and across my bed. At first I tried to sweep them off, but there were so many. By that time my father had managed to purchase a few more chickens, and as I looked out my open door I saw a gang of them walking past. "Come here, chickens," I called out. "Do I have a treat for you?" I tossed a few termites out the door to lure them in. Once they realized what a great bounty was waiting for them outside my room, they went mad with hunger. Soon my floor and bed were filled with chickens, squawking and flapping their wings with excitement as they pecked at the helpless termites. "Get them all," I shouted. "I don't want to see another one alive." The termite incident caused such a commotion that I didn't even notice the smell of something burned. After the chickens cleared out, I looked closely at the broken beam that hung from the ceiling, and saw that my wires had crossed during the collapse. Instead of starting a fire, they were so cheap and thin they'd simply melted and snapped in two. I thanked God no one had been hurt. Jeffrey came over and we stared at this mess together. "Hey, Pambo, it's a good thing I'm too poor to buy proper wire," I said. "If I'd used anything better I'd have burned up my home. I warned you about the roof." Sure, but I didn't listen." I needed a proper wiring system, and as always, I returned to my explaining physics book and found just the model. Page 271 had a diagram of a main system from a home in Britain. The drawing showed that when the wires ran from the main power supply, the first place they led was to a circuit breaker, which worked to kill the power when the circuit became overloaded. I needed one of these. The circuit breaker in the diagram used fuses, which contained tiny metal filaments that melted when the overload occurred. I didn't have any fuses, so like with everything else, I improvised by using what I had around my house. Instead of a filament and fuse system, I modeled my circuit breaker after the electric bell, which I'd also read about in the book. An electric bell works when a coil suddenly becomes magnetized and pulls a metal hammer that strikes the bell. However, during this motion, the hammer also trips a switch and breaks the circuit, returning to its original position. Of course, this happens about a dozen times per second. I started my circuit breaker by constructing a breaker box using melted PVC pipe, as I had done with my switches. I wrapped the heads of two nails with copper wire to create two electromagnetic coils, then mounted them inside the box, with the coils facing each other about 5 inches apart. Coming up through the middle, I placed a bar magnet from a radio speaker attached to a bicycle spoke that could easily flip from side to side. I then took a spring from a ballpoint pen and stretched it out. I placed it between the bar magnet and nail where it rested lightly against the circuit's live wire. Basically, this spring completed the circuit and acted as a kind of trap. When the light was turned on, the electricity flowed from the battery to the circuit and magnetized my two nails, one of which was situated slightly closer to my bar magnet. The polarity is determined by which position the current runs, and I'd wrapped the nails with wire so the one closest to the magnets pushed while the other nail pulled. This pushing and pulling from both sides kept the bar magnet delicately balanced, never knowing what to do. In the event of a power surge, this balance would be broken. The nail closest to the bar magnet would receive the surge first, pushing it vigorously into the other nail, knocking the pin sprig loose from the wire, and breaking the circuit and flow of current. Once this was built, I nailed the circuit breaker box to my wall just above the battery. Every night I sat on my bed and stared at the box, waiting for it to work. I got my wish about 2 weeks later when a cyclone hit my house. I had been in the trading center all day, and when I returned I noticed something odd. Bits and pieces of my thatch roof were lying in the yard, and my roof itself looked as if a giant had given my house a good shaking. My mother came out from the kitchen. "What happened?" I said. "A big cyclone just came from the fields. We had to run inside." When I went inside my room, I saw that my poor roof had collapsed again, and bits of ceiling were all over the floor. I also noticed that the circuit breaker had flipped. I moved the magnet back to the middle, but it refused. I tried again, but the magnet swung back into the nail. After disconnecting the battery, I followed my wires along the ceiling and discovered they had become tangled in the cyclone winds. After separating the wires and reconnecting the battery, the bar magnet flipped back between the two nails. Once again, I'd narrowly escaped a fire. But I was more excited about my circuit breaker than anything. "See, man, the house would be ashes right now," I told Jeffrey. "All of my clothes and blankets would be gone. The circuit breaker worked." "The circuit breaker is great," he said, "but I think a better solution would be to fix your roof." My new invention is going to have its share of problems. Any new invention is going to have its share of problems. And aside from the amateur wiring, one of my other headaches was the bike chain. Whenever the wind blew very hard and spun the blades, the chain would snap, or simply jump off the teeth of the sprocket, forcing me to climb up the tower to fix it. This required stopping the blades, a task I hated. One morning I was sleeping really well, one of those peaceful sleeps just before the cock crows. I think I was even smiling in my dreams when a terrible racket forced me to wake. I knew just what it was. The chain had slipped again. I heard the wind whipping the acacia tree outside, and my tower was rocking back and forth. The blades were spinning so fast they were buzzing on the rotor. If I didn't fix them, they'd eventually snap in two, flying through the air like daggers. This frightening thought was enough to push me out of my warm bed. Earlier, I'd come up with a wonderful plan of installing a brake system that would stop the blades by simply pulling a handle. It would be similar to the coaster brakes that stop a bicycle by pedaling backwards. These brakes worked by using a special hub, which contains a gear system that locks when backward motion is applied. The plan was to attach this hub to the shaft, then trigger it by jerking a cable from below, ideally one that ran into my room so I wouldn't have to get out of bed to operate it. But after weeks of searching, I couldn't find the right hub, and so I had no braking system in place. This morning, I had to do it the hard way. I climbed to the top of the tower and, as usual, kicked off my flip-flops so I could get a better grip. But the wind was violent and angry, pushing the tower from side to side so much that I thought it would tip. I wrapped my legs through the rungs and held on for life. But in trying to keep my balance, I didn't notice the bicycle frame swinging forward along with the tower. The next gust of wind sent the blades straight into my hand and knocked me off balance. I slipped and nearly fell, grabbing hold of the rungs and cursing. Looking at my hand, I saw the blades had shaved the meat off three of my knuckles, which were now dripping blood that scattered with the wind. "You are my own creation," I shouted to my windmill, "so why are you trying to destroy me? Please, let me help you." Once I regained my balance, I pulled a thick strip of bicycle tire from my pocket that I'd cut for such repairs. Gripping it in the palm of my hand, I held my breath and grabbed hold of the spinning sprocket. I felt the jagged teeth cut into the rubber like a sawing blade. "Stop!" Once I managed to stop the blades, I shoved the bent bicycle spoke into the wheel to keep the machine from spinning, then reattached the chain. The next time this happened, I wasn't so lucky. The teeth on the sprocket finally cut through the bike tire and ripped my flesh. Then it happened again. I still have scars from this whole painful period. During this time, Jeffrey was still working with Uncle Muzawale at the maize mill in Chimumba. He'd been hired to sweep the floor and fetch things for our uncle whenever he needed them. But once there, our uncle mostly drank, and Jeffrey was forced to run the mill on his own. He'd wake up early and do maintenance work on the machines, making sure they were filled with diesel and oil. Then he would open for business. At night, he shared a bedroom with Musawale, who'd come home from the bar singing merrily before collapsing into a deep snoring sleep. Chipamumba was about 25 kilometers away, and almost once a month Jeffrey would bike home and tell me about his hard life as a working man. They forced me to ride up 5 hills to get diesel, he said. And on the way back, the fuel soaks my clothes. I'm telling you, brother, I'm missing you guys terribly. But he also described how the grinding machines in the mill operated by using pulleys and rubber belts. You can get rid of this chain problem if you use a belt, he said. They use them on the mill and they never fail. This was great news. A pulley was just what I needed to increase the tension between the front and back sprockets, which was the reason the chain kept flying off. And unlike a chain, a belt didn't have troublesome cogs that constantly required grease, which I'd long run out of. Going to the scrapyard, I was easily able to find 2 pulleys from an old water-pumping engine. I used a piece of heavy steel and hammered at them for several hours, snapping their cotter pins and sliding them off the machine. But the center hole of the larger pulley was too big for my shock absorber shaft to fit. I had to weld it alongside the sprocket himself. These days, Mr. Godstein the welder no longer made fun of me. Whenever he saw me walking up holding these random pieces, he just smiled and fired up his torch. Tell me where, he said. Mr. Godstein even let me use his grinder to flatten all those sharp teeth on the sprocket until its edges were smooth. It felt like sweet revenge watching them reduced to nothing under a shower of sparks. This is for all my scars, I shouted. Once I installed the pulleys that afternoon, they seemed to work great. The only problem was that I didn't have a proper belt. Looking around for something to hold me over, I cut the handle off an old nylon bag and rigged it around the pulleys. It worked for about 10 seconds before slipping off. I then cut open a few batteries and removed the black jelly inside, a kind of tar that houses the cell's carbon rod, hoping that would work as an adhesive. But the tar simply wore away after a few hours. An old man at the trading center then gave me an actual belt from a milling machine. He was using it to fashion vegetables to his bike, but it was broken in half, forcing me to mend it constantly with my crochet needle and fiber from a car tire. That never lasted long. But with nothing else, I was forced to use this for 2 months. Even after all that trouble, I was still climbing the tower twice a day. Finally, Jeffrey returned from Chipamumba with a good belt that worked beautifully. At last, no more injuries on the job. Even better, no more getting out of bed in the early morning to climb the tower. Instead, when the first crow of the cock stirred me from my dreams, which it always did, the steady hum of the spinning machine would sing me back to sleep. But that cough was a persistent one, and often not even my windmill could guarantee my rest. Chicken, I screamed, if you don't shut up, it will be your skinny neck spitting from those blades. Cock-a-doodle-doo! It was no use. Conquering darkness on the farm was hard enough, but a noisy chicken, that was impossible.